A bloodthirsty zombie mutilates a lifeless body. A sadistic doctor drugs and tortures his patients. And a family makes a grim discovery that their house is haunted by a demonic demon. Horror movies are designed to make us scared. So you would assume that every instinct we have would make us want to look away or turn the channel because of the fear that is surging through our veins. Yet surprisingly, many people, including myself, love them. And we are drawn to the screen, and we crave more and more and more. And this raises an intriguing question. Why do we like to be scared? What is the psychology of liking horror? Regardless of what subgenre of horror you like, whether psychological thrillers or something really gory or maybe something paranormal, there's always that element of surprise or suspense. And you could make an argument that that's something that we learn to enjoy. Right through our experiences, we learn to anticipate things jumping out, and it's really exciting. But could you also make the argument that maybe we are wired to enjoy that type of surprise and anticipation? When I think about games we played as a kid, and I'm sure you've played this game hundreds, if not thousands of times with your children, or maybe you played, is peekaboo, right? And peekaboo, in a weird way, kind of mimics or mirrors what we see in horror movies, right? This kind of jump scare, right? Something that jumps out, right? We open up and we scare our babies, right? And they love to anticipate that. Now, you do have psychologists like, Jean Piaget, right? Developmental psychologists who would argue, well, the whole point of peekaboo, right, is that children are developing what we call object permanence. Okay? And object permanence is the idea that children realize that if they don't see something or can't see it, they still know it exists, right? In other words, children like peekaboo because if I hide myself, they still know I'm behind closed doors, so to speak. But if you think about all the games that we play as children, not just peekaboo, but even things like tag, right, and hide and seek. Right? Think about hide and seek. You're hiding in a dark closet waiting for somebody to come attack you. That what all of these kind of show us is that, especially as children, is that something like fear, right, or being scared, is not something you have to be afraid of, but maybe fear can be pleasurable, right? Be a pleasurable experience or fun. So as we talk about the psychology of liking horror, we have to come in mind that maybe there is some sort of wiring of the brain that we do like this anticipation. We do like this sort of suspense. And I think peekaboo is a great way to start. All right, now before we go over all this kind of different ideas like sensation seeking and posted on euphoria, I first want to cover is what is happening in the human body that actually produces the fear response, right? When you are in a movie theater and you're watching the killer clown or you hear those little footsteps and your heart starts to race, right? What is happening in the body that produces this fear response? And by going over that, it's going to help make sense of all these different things that make us like horror. All right, so let's start with this. What actually begins this sort of triggering of a fear response? And what's going to trigger is, of course, you have to have some sort of threat. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, this threat has to be real. A gun to your head, somebody's trying to rob you, somebody's trying to fight you, right? Or thousands of years ago, a woolly mammoth is trying to step on your head, right? But today, threats come in various shapes and sizes. It could be a real threat, or it could be an imagined threat, like watching a movie or public speaking. Your brain doesn't really know the difference. But in our case, let's say we're watching a movie, right? We're watching something about killer clowns, right? And a threat can be visual, right? Watching something really scary. It can also be auditory, right? In the real world, hearing a police siren. Or in a horror movie, hearing the footsteps, right? The sound of scary music, right? Imagine watching a horror movie with no music. What would that be like? Probably not scary. Regardless, we have a threat. And what's going to happen is this threat is going to trigger a really important part of our brain, right? That signal is going to go through the eye, up the, what do we call this? The optic nerve. And it's going to hit a really important structure right here, really tiny, the shape of an almond, called the amygdala. What do we call this? The amygdala. And the amygdala is the alarm system for the body. It's the thing that sets things in motion that danger, 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 and we need to start preparing to fight or flee or do something in between. Now, what's interesting about this, and I do want to write the word amygdala as we think about kind of the steps of what is happening in the brain, is we actually recognize a fear response before we even know what the fear is, right? In other words, this information from the eye has to go to a part of the brain that processes visual information. Do we know what lobe that would be? back of our head, that's the occipital lobe, right? That's our visual cortex. So what this is saying is that we recognize the fear before we even know what has actually happened, right? Somebody jumps out, we're scared, and then we're like, oh, that's what made us scared. So in a weird way, we recognize fear first, and then, right? And then it goes to the cortex, the wrinkled part of our brain, and we say, oh, that's what the fear is, right? All right, so we recognize the fear, we've processed what that fear is, and then what's going to happen is we're going to communicate with a few parts of our brain. Specifically, this structure right here in green, which is what's called the what is it called? The hypothalamus. Okay, the hypothalamus. This is a really important structure. This is essentially the CEO of the brain, right? It maintains what we call homeostasis. If you feel hungry, you eat. If you're thirsty, you drink. If you're cold, you get hot. If you're hot, you get cold. It's like the internal thermostat of the body. And this is going to play a big part as well in triggering our nervous system. So what is it? We have our hypothalamus. Okay? I always like the structure. It kind of does everything, or it's the everything of the brain, right? And what this is going to do, and we'll talk about this as well, is it's actually going to trigger, use a marker, a part of the brain, a gland called the pituitary gland. Now, we're not going to go too much in depth, but it is important to know that this is like the second in command, right? It's like the CEO of a company, and the second chain is the pituitary gland. It's the master gland that controls all the other glands. We'll talk about why that's important in a moment. But this gland and the hypothalamus are going to then talk to our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system. Autonomic means automatic. Specifically, a part called our what is it called? Our sympathetic nervous system. Okay? Why is this important? This is what triggers, this is really important, our fight or flight. And you know what, I'm going to add a third F? Because we have fight, or freeze, right? Kind of add a third there. We either fight, we run, or maybe we freeze, right? We don't know what to do. So we're going to have our three Fs. And our sympathetic nervous system is going to start that process. So what is it going to do? Well, it's really going to do a few, well, it does many things, but in our purposes, it's going to, I have a little air here, it's going to, one, speed up our heartbeat, right? Get more blood to our muscles so I can run or fight. It's going to dilate my pupils, right? As opposed to having vision out here, it's going to be tunnel vision, right? I got to see my enemy, right? So instead of vision, this way, I'm looking straight out, right? Very, very sharp vision. It's going to relax my airways in my lungs so I can breathe better, right? More oxygen as well. And it's also going to kind of relax and slow down digestion. In other words, I don't need to digest my food if I'm trying to survive. So anything that is not for survival is going to shut down. So that's just part of, or examples of, what our sympathetic nervous system might do. Now, lastly, what is going to happen is that the sympathetic nervous system, including the amygdala and hypothalamus, are going to talk to another gland, and the master gland will also play a role, in what's called the adrenal glands. What is it called? The adrenal glands. And the adrenal glands sit right above your kidney. Now, these are important because these release those chemicals that are going to really trigger that fight or flight response. Can you think of any of those chemicals? Well, if you're thinking, one, epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, the same thing. Let's write that again, epinephrine. Okay, so if you hear adrenaline or epinephrine, they're talking about the same thing. Norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline, right? You ever heard of an EpiPen, right? Epi, right? Kind of means the same idea. And a stress hormone that isn't bad unless it is prolonged, happens, chronically, is cortisol, right? That's a little hormone, cortisol. Right? So you have all these chemicals, whether hormones or neurotransmitters, that are being flooded in the body that produce all this kind of fight or flight. So whether we are bungee jumping, skydiving, we're watching a horror movie, somebody's trying to attack us, your brain essentially is going to respond the same way. And just for reference, if you ever hear somebody talking about the HPA axis, let's write that in, the HPA axis. This is our fear response. Essentially, the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis is what triggers our fight or flight. All right, so there's some basic knowledge of what is happening when you are scared and watching those horror movies, what is happening inside the body. So let's start with a really important question. Who is more likely to seek out horror movies in the first place? And we're going to call this sensation seeking. And sensation seeking is actually, in psychology, a personality type or a personality trait. okay? And this is a trait that some people have and some people don't have, which tells you it's partly hereditary, right? It's kind of passed down. I can't just choose to be a sensation seeker and seek out really exciting things or really novel things. It might be just something that I am born with. But there's a couple of traits that kind of play a role in sensation seeking. Okay, do we know what those traits are? One, these people love novel things, right? Things that are new. Let's seek out new experiences, right? I'm bored. I gotta, go to a new place, new vacation, new home, or something like that. It's people who like intense things, right? Things that bring a lot of excitement. And lastly, things that are maybe risky or impulsive, right? I'm not going to really think about the consequences. I'm going to do it and live with it and see what happens, right? So who likes horror movies is essentially the same people who like bungee jumping and moving a lot and like skydiving and doing these really sensation-seeking things, right? This is a personality trait. And another way to think about this in psychology is that we are motivated by certain things. In psychology, say we're motivated by what we call an optimum level of arousal, okay? In other words, you need a certain level of arousal to feel happy in life, right? So this is our optimum level of arousal right here, right? So if I'm bored, for example, and I'm down here, maybe I'll play basketball, right? And this will bring me back to my optimum level, right? So I'm nice and happy. Or maybe I will, go for a run if I'm bored to reach my optimum level. But for sensation seekers, the argument is that they have an optimum level of arousal too. Theirs is just higher, right? Theirs is up here. So what does that mean? That means they need more stimulation to feel that kind of maximum arousal, right? They have a higher threshold of arousal than, let's say, that I do, right? So playing basketball or going for a run is not going to let them reach that optimum level. They need, well, maybe as we're talking about here, maybe they need to watch a horror movie, right? They need to watch a horror movie, and that's what's going to bring them to their optimum level, right? So everybody's level is different to motivate them to do different things. And what's all connected to this, and I know you've heard this term before, is maybe it's also related to adrenaline or epinephrine, right? Adrenaline junkies, right? Adrenaline, or I'll just do this. I'll say adrenaline rush, right? That sensation seekers are always seeking out that adrenaline, that rush, right? And what does that have to do with horror? Well, if you have this adrenaline rush, right? And we talked about the sympathetic nervous system. Well, what this is basically is that oxygen, okay, is being rerouted to the brain. Okay, now why is that important? It's because when oxygen is rerouted to the brain, things happen up here, which become highly addictive. What is it? Well, for one, you get more energy, right? And who doesn't want more energy, right? It makes us more focused, right, this adrenaline. It gives us more power, right? We feel more powerful when we have this kind of adrenaline rush. And it creates a sense of flow. Do you know what flow is? Flow is when we're so in the moment, we're so immersed, nothing around us exists, right? And all of this, right, you can argue is quite addictive, right? Who doesn't want adrenaline and energy and focus and feel more powerful, right? So maybe there's kind of an addictive element of this where I need to kind of boost it as well. And maybe there's also that dopamine right hit as well of pleasure, and more pleasure. Now, here's an interesting thought. What if the experience of horror, going to a movie or going to a haunted house, is not what drives us to go back for more, right? What if it's the feeling after the event that is so addictive? This is what I label as the post-event euphoria. So instead of an adrenaline rush, what we're going to say is, what if you have what we call an endorphin rush? What is it called? An endorphin rush, right? And here's the idea of it. If you go to an event, right, and it's really scary, like a haunted house, and you survive, right, you survive. Think about that feeling afterward. It feels so good. I survived, I did it, I conquered my fears, and that arousal hasn't really gone away. You still kind of have that excited state of arousal. This is that post-euphoric high that a lot of people crave. Maybe it's not the event, maybe it's after the event. Remember the sympathetic nervous system causing fight, flight, or flee? Well, what calms you down? Well, what calms you down after the event, and this is tied all to this, is what we call not the sympathetic branch, but the parasympathetic branch. Parasympathetic nervous system. Okay? And the parasympathetic nervous system, all right, nervous system, NS, is what prepares or slows down the body after a threat is alleviated, right? After a threat is gone. And this is really addictive. You know why? Because it releases a lot of feel-good hormones and neurotransmitters. Things like endorphins. Do we know what endorphins are? Well, endorphins, make sure I spell that right, is pain relief, right? It activates the same opioid receptors as, let's say, heroin, right? It's kind of got that same pain relief and calming feel. Or maybe things like dopamine, right? Which is pleasure that motivates me to do things again and again and again that feel good, right? We see dopamine hits with novel activities. And even things, kind of our mood neurotransmitter is serotonin. Serotonin, okay? So here's what you have. Maybe it's not the event, maybe it's the post-event that is bringing us back for more and more and more. All right, so if this side is all the biological, physiological stuff, what about the psychology? What is happening up here? Well, is it possible that horror movies, and anything horror related in a genre, actually provide psychological benefits to us? There is a lot of research there. And I call this resilience and satisfaction. And the first thing I'm going to write down, which is really important, is that what if horror movies actually prepare us for the real world? In other words, what if it's kind of like a threat simulation? Okay, so bear with me. Imagine, for example, I'm watching a zombie apocalypse, right? And I'm watching all the characters do what they do. Can I use that information to help me in my real world? Absolutely. And there's a lot of evidence to show that, yes, of course, I don't have a zombie attacking me, but my brain doesn't know the difference. Maybe it's my boss is out to get me, right? And I'm learning how to cope with those ideas of some sort of trauma. So threat simulation is the idea that we are modeling, we're mirroring what we would do in that situation, which makes us what? It makes us resilient, right? It makes us psychologically powerful. It gives us a toolkit to handle things in the real world. So I'm actually going to write the idea of play fear, right? In other words, you can have fun with fear, right? We can play with it, or recreational fear. And the second part of resilience, and this is really good studies, is that it helps with coping skills, right? So for example, how do we cope with things? It helps us cope with stressors. There's a really good study I'll put in the chat box that shows who was more resilient or who was better prepared in the first stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you think who was more prepared, right? Who was more resilient? What researchers have found is people who like horror movies because they weren't necessarily scared. They had been mentally preparing for that event, so to speak, in movies, right? Playing it out or mirroring it in movies. And then people who also like horror movies are also better regulating emotions, right? So emotional regulation. So if I'm fearful or I'm scared, I know how to handle that, right? Also, there's a satisfaction part, right? If you go to a haunted house, you watch a scary movie, there is a feeling like I accomplished something, right? There's a feeling of accomplishment, right? I did it, right? I survived. And that is an addictive feeling as well, right? And something that we might want to seek out again and again and again. And the other idea of satisfaction is maybe we're satisfied in the sense that it provides escapism, right? In other words, movies, horror movies, provide some sort of distraction from everyday life, right? I don't have to deal with my relationship, my boss, my kids. I can kind of zone that out and focus in on this, cool, paranormal, gory, killer thing that is scary, but it is an escapism. So that's satisfying. That's satisfying to escape reality a little bit. And it's also important to know that what all these have in common is you have to be in a safe environment. In other words, all the evidence shows that if you do feel like you are better at coping and you feel more accomplished, you have to have that sight of, I do feel safe, right? This isn't real. These are actors. Nothing is going to happen to me. And if you have that feeling, then all of these should come true. Now, another idea of the psychology of liking horror. Is it possible we closer together? Social bonding and attraction. Now, a lot of us probably don't see horror movies or go to haunted houses by ourselves. Now, you can, and probably you have, but a lot of us probably do it together. And what research has shown is that if you go to horror movies or you go to haunted houses, it creates kind of a feeling of closeness, right? That people tend to get closer together when they do horror-related things. And one of the reasons is because you have a hormone in your brain related to, where is it? Our pituitary gland, that creates this bonding sensation between people. It's released during during activities, pleasurable activities, sex, breastfeeding, pregnancy and birth, right? Anything that's kind of really important for two people to bond. And that it would be oxytocin. So we have a lot of oxytocin released during that kind of post-scared phase after a horror movie. And what's also interesting, and this is the coolest research, is that people tend to be more attracted to each other after they've experienced some sort of horror event. So for example, on a scale of 1 to 10, and you say, how attractive is your partner that you're with? And you might say a 5. But if you go to something like, a movie like It or a Killer Clown, maybe you say it's an 8. And you think, why would something like horror make somebody more attractive? Well, it's actually a misattribution. You see, what happens is, you're aroused, right? Your heart's pumping, you're scared, right? Think about everything our sympathetic nervous system does. In a weird way, your brain is confused. It doesn't know if you're attracted or aroused because of the haunted house or the horror or the partner you're with, right? It's a misattribution. So everything in terms of being more attracted to a person, it's really misattribution. Why am I aroused? I don't know. It must be the person I'm with. When in reality, it just might be the horror-related genre. Okay, another or our last reason we're going to talk about, and this is my favorite, is our good friend Sigmund Freud. Morbid curiosity. Is it possible, and you know about this when you see car crashes on the road, that we are just really, when we like horror movies, we are exploring kind of just the dark side of humanity, right? Not to get too, existential, but, when you watch people get maimed and killed, that makes us ask a lot of questions, right? What is life? What is death? Why am I here? What does it mean to be human? If you pass a car that has crashed on the side of the road, don't tell me you are not slowing down to watch it. There's this kind of death or morbid curiosity that we do have. And maybe it's just curiosity, maybe it's just fascination, maybe it's part of this adrenaline rush. And the reason I have Freud here, and I would love to spend hours on Freud, and this is controversial, but I do want to talk about it, is Freud argued that human beings have what we call a death instinct. What is called a death instinct, kind of like a death wish, okay? Now, Freud would first say, and he's our psychoanalyst, that we have a life instinct, an eros, that we're all motivated by pleasure and our libido, and we want to do everything that our id says. We'll talk about that in another video. But at the same token, we all have a drive to die. And you might say, I don't want to die. Well, his argument is, well, then why do we do destructive behaviors? Why do we smoke cigarettes, drink alcohol? Why do I bungee jump? Why do I hang out with people who aren't good for me, right? In other words, part of this horror allure is maybe it's our drive unconsciously to seek out death or to see what death is like. So of course, controversial, interesting, but it's just another thought when it comes to the psychology of liking horror, this kind of death instinct and morbid curiosity. All right, guys, thanks for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a deeper and better understanding of horror and why we are driven to such darkness. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe. I'll see you next time.